It appears that the Israel Defense Forces have almost completed their mission in Rafah, the Gazan city nearest the Egyptian border. It's now believed that enormous amounts of munitions have flowed to Hamas from Egypt under that border. Meanwhile, Hezbollah continues its rocket and missile war against northern Israel, a conflict that began on October 8th, the day after Hamas's invasion of Israel and massacre of Israeli civilians. Behind Hezbollah, behind Hamas, behind Islamic Jihad, behind the Houthi rebels in Yemen and multiple Shia militias in Syria and Iraq is an expanding jihadist empire whose metropole is in Tehran. Seth Cropsey recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal that Israel faces a tough choice: to go to war directly against the Tehran regime now, or to go to war against the Tehran regime later. He added, "The political conditions for war now are poor. The strategic conditions later will only grow worse." Seth Cropsey served as a naval officer and as a deputy undersecretary of the Navy, and he's the author of Mayday, The Decline of American Naval Supremacy, and Sea Blindness, How Political Neglect is Choking American Sea Power and What to Do About It. He's president of the Yorktown Institute, and he's with us today. Also on board, Mark Montgomery, a retired Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy. His assignments included Director of Operations at U.S. Pacific Command and Deputy Director for Plans, Policy, and Strategy at U.S. European Command. He was assigned to the National Security Council from 1998 to 2000, serving as Director for Transnational Threats. He's currently Senior Director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. I'm Cliff May, and I'm going to ask both about Tehran's war strategy, the Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in one of the world's most strategic international waterways, about Beijing's threat to Taiwan, and who knows what else. But you'll find out if you stay with us for this conversation here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Seth. Thanks for being here. Good to see you, Monty. Seth, you mainly write about naval issues, maritime issues. So I'm curious to know what compelled you to make these arguments in the Wall Street Journal the other day, which really caught my eye, about the war being waged against Israel.
Well, what compelled me is that the Hezbollah has basically changed Israel's northern border. That 60 to 80,000 people, Israelis who have been forced to move out of the range of some of Hezbollah's rockets, need to return home. But most important, that the war is likely to move to the north once operations are essentially over in the south. And that will continue the Iranian strategy of using proxies as the tip of their spear in their effort to drive the United States out of the Middle East and to destroy Israel.
A pretty good strategy that the Iranian regime has, it seems to me, for a whole lot of reasons. For one, they can, the Ayatollah Khamenei can sleep comfortably in his bed at night, I assume. Unlike Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, he doesn't live in a bunker. It's a multi-front war. Yet if most of the media, most of the people at the UN don't probably conceive it that way. They're mostly concerned that, the poor people of Gaza, they're in such dire straits because Israel has reoccupied Gaza, which they claim was occupied before. It hasn't been occupied since 2005. I'll just mention, I remember going to Israel many times over the past 20 years and saying to Israelis, "Hey, I hear they got like 150,000 missiles pointing at you from the north. Aren't you worried about that? Don't you have to do something about that?" And the Israeli kind of response was, "You know what? Don't worry about it. We know what we're doing. We got this under control." I used to have complete confidence. I guess I have less so now. Go ahead, Monty. Maybe have a few comments on all that.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And I appreciate being on with Seth. I do think, I agree with Seth's assessment of the tactical situation in Gaza and his discussion of the strategic dilemma they have with Iran. I think one thing that complicates it is the operational dilemma I see. Yeah. And that's what I saw. I just went on an FDD trip there.
Right.
We took some fellows around. I took the opportunity to meet privately with active and retired IDF generals. First, I will say, among their general officer corps, there is an understanding that they underestimated, to quote George Bush, the threat, and I think
the threat of Hezbollah,
the threat of
threat of Hamas,
yeah,
and
everything,
yeah.
And I think there is a level of humility about that. Look, I think I'm worried because, you and I have discussed this over the last couple of years. I thought they weren't spending their money properly in the IDF. I talked about it a bit and was told by the IDF not to worry. And unfortunately, one of the areas where they were not spending enough money was munitions stowage, stockpiling. They did not have enough for the multi-threat war that they always told us was inevitable. Well, they've had one front play out. They've used an excessive amount of ammunition. We have given them a lot. I was shocked at the number of 2,000-pound bombs we've delivered, 14,000 over the last 7 months.
Even though there's been a holdup on those and maybe other munitions, I should just point out, people are...
Certainly there's a holdup on one shipment, and I believe there's a slowdown. We are no longer fast-tracking other requests. I think that's what Netanyahu is poorly trying to articulate, maybe successfully for his domestic audience, but poorly for the U.S. audience. But I think that's sort of. But I'm going to get to the point of they don't have them. They would win a fight against Hezbollah. I'm not saying that. They'd win even better if we were participating. I don't think that's likely. I don't think we want to.
And what is participating?
Well, I would say if we had, if we were providing a certain number of strikes per night from B-2s and F-35s in a reasonably risk-free way
at Hezbollah's rockets and missile launchers and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
For that to happen, it would have to be such a clear Hezbollah or Iranian-initiated event. But to get to the point of the Israelis do not have enough to win enough munitions. What I mean, there's the 1,500-pound, the JDAM adapter kits that allow them to be precision-guided munitions, even the 155 and 120 millimeter for their tanks. And the way I look at it is it's kind of like a seesaw. If they don't have enough munitions, then the casualty rates are much higher. Those are casualty rates for the IDF because there's more ground warfare. Israeli civilians, because more and more things hit. They're slower to attrite the Hezbollah precision-guided munitions. More towers get hit in Haifa and Tel Aviv. More civilians die. And there's more Lebanese collateral damage, accidental killing civilians because they're co-located with these weapon systems and we're hitting them with less precise weapons. If we can get the munition numbers up, I think all three of those casualty numbers go down. I think this is the kind of operational level of war decision-making the Israelis are going to have to make. I think if they waited 12 months, they'd be in a much better position in munitions than they will be, say, next month.
The two questions come to mind. One is that the Biden administration, if it would like to prevent at least an escalation of the war in the North, which it clearly would like to prevent, would it not be in its interest strategically just to make clear to Hezbollah, you don't want to go to war with Israel, we're backing Israel, we're supplying Israel, and also because Biden would like less collateral damage, so you want to give, for example, more JDAMs, more precision munitions to Israel. That would seem to be strategically advisable, but it does not appear to be what the Biden administration is doing.
That you're operating under a strategic rationality model that is different from the one that the Biden administration uses. And their understanding of deterrence is not your understanding or my understanding of deterrence. And so telling them that the way to avoid escalation is to discourage Hezbollah from escalating is, in their ears, oh, you mean you want us to give the weapons to Israel so they can initiate a fight?
So I don't think Israelis want to initiate a fight, and I'm
explaining what
they're hearing. But I mean, I'll just throw this on that E.L. Hulada, who certainly Mati, he was the national security advisor to Netanyahu at one point. Not Netanyahu. He was national security advisor to Bennett and to Lapid, more the kind of moderate coalition government. He's FDD senior international fellow now. He's recently quoted in the New York Times in a Ronan Bergen piece. He says, if we're dragged into a bigger war, we have enough resources and manpower, but we'd like to do it in the best conditions we can. At the moment, we don't have the best conditions. So, I mean,
Yeah, that's what I just said. And I back up. I agree completely with Seth that this is an erroneous interpretation of deterrence by the Biden administration. I know we'll talk about the Houthis later on, but let me just say, this paradigm extends for these guys. And I'd go further and say how they've executed the war in Russia reflects that lack of understanding. They are trapped in this, and what Brad Bowman, our senior director of the CMP, the military power program here, says is like a provocation principle, where they're more worried about the provocative action that the provocation that a deterrence would do, vice the amelioratory, the palliative, hey, do not do this action. And look, we're a big power. We need to act like a big power. And a big power says and does things to signal to smaller and medium-sized powers, do not do this, or I will hold you accountable. And one of the ways you do that is you ship weapons to Israel. One of the ways you do that is you tell the Ukrainians you can use these weapons to strike Russian movements. You explain to the aggressor, I'm going to hold you accountable for this aggression, and then you take actions that allow that to happen.
And instead, if I understand this is simplifying, I guess, but tell me if it oversimplifies, you have the Biden administration trying to avoid escalation by reassuring everybody, reassuring Putin, reassuring the Ayatollah Khamenei, reassuring the Chinese, hey, we don't want escalation. Just because you guys know, we don't want escalation. And I think my guess is they say, yeah, we know that about you, and because you don't, we can escalate more, and you will continue to make concessions. Is that not the paradigm?
And what's more, and what is equally telling and inexplicable is that the Biden administration ought to have learned from the experience of the war in Ukraine over the past 2 years that every time a new weapon system, new American weapon system is proposed to sell to the Ukrainians, Putin starts waving the nuclear sword and the carrying on and whatnot. And then after dragging its feet, the Biden administration makes the transfer, makes the sale, and nothing happens. And it's been that way with javelins, with HIMARS, with the whole range of weapons that we've supplied them with. So in each case, it's a warning and bleeding and,
right,
all the fireworks, and then nothing happens.
Right.
These guys, the Obama and Biden administrations have collectively given red lines a bad name. Let's be clear. Red lines governed how we dealt with the Soviet Union. You won't go through the Fulda Gap. You won't overrun our brigade in Berlin. You won't do that. There was a series of you won'ts, and they worked. They for some reason, that is deterrence. Deterrence was 450,000 U.S. troops, backed up by about 40% of all our munitions in Europe. Our Western Europe. I mean, that we understood deterrence just fine. What's happened is that what they're trying to do is do like consequence-free actions. Like, I'm going to do this, but not allow you to use it. I'm going to give you weapons, but at too slow a rate to rearm yourself. These are sucker bets for our allies and partners, for Ukraine, for Israel, and probably eventually for Taiwan if they're not careful. We have to be stronger, more disciplined, and more directive about what is unacceptable behavior and what we're going to do about it, and how we're going to make investments ahead of time to prevent you from doing it.
All right, one more question for you on this, Seth, before we go on. It was, if you're suggesting, I think you are in this piece, that the Israelis need to go directly after Tehran sooner rather than later, how do they go about that? Because do they not have to, maybe they can, fight Hezbollah and Tehran at the same time? And if they go after Tehran, what do they do? Do they sink the Navy? Do they try to get rid of the nuclear weapons development, which is very deeply buried? I'm not sure they have the weapons for that. Do they try to decapitate? What do they, in other words, if it's better for them or less bad to go after Tehran now, how does that happen?
I think sinking their navy would be a very helpful start, and it's operationally within their means. Um, but the long-term goal that the United States and Israel share is regime change. I haven't figured out a better word to use for it. I'm working on that because it's a dirty word right now.
I know,
But
but
if there were ever a case for regime change, Iran is the case. And the real issue behind all of this is Iran and the ideology of the Gulen clerics. And as long as that ideology governs Iran, the Iranians will continue with their nuclear program. They'll build nuclear weapons. They'll put them aboard missiles with increasing range. They'll supply the proxies. They'll encourage them. And that is the head of the Hydra. Going after the arms is important and significant in immediate terms, but the long-term goal should be to get rid of these people.
yeah, and I'll just point out that FTD's Mark Dubowitz has talked about this, written about this a lot, and it includes such things as absolute maximum pressure, so you don't give them billions and tens of billions of dollars, as has been the case under the current administration. There was much more economic pressure in the Trump administration. You support the people of the country who are going out on the streets, risking their lives, losing their lives, shouting "Death to the dictator." Got to support them in every way. You use all instruments of power that you possibly have, and you don't try to make a deal with this regime, respecting its equities and believing that you can have a share the neighborhood policy, which is what Obama believed he could have and should have, and that would work out fine if we just showed respect.
Yeah, that's the Biden policy is simply the Obama policy carried over under this cockamamie idea that Iran can somehow supply strategic equilibrium in the Middle East, which is sort of like thinking that Nazi Germany could supply equilibrium in the 1930s and 1940s. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Hey, one thing I would add is if I were Israel, if I were the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and I had a choice, I'd take my enemies on one by one. Look, Israel can defeat Hezbollah in the sense of moving Hezbollah's forces north of the Litani River and destroying their ability, a significant portion of their ability to strike into Israel. Though I think a war with Iran, it's harder to see the end game in that, but they do pretty well in a back and forth.
That wasn't Mark. I wasn't suggesting that Israel take on the burden of attacking Iran by itself. How many American presidents have said, "I will not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons"?
Many, and do you believe them? Or do they say, "Whoops, we meant well"? But no, I hear you. I don't. But I think it's very bad for U.S. credibility. Not the only thing to say. We will not accept this. We will not tolerate this. This cannot happen. We will prevent this. And then you don't do it. That's a message to your allies that you're unreliable. It's a message to your enemies that you're harmless. To paraphrase Bernard Lewis. All right, moving swiftly along. It seems to me that among the U.S. Navy's key missions must be, one, to guarantee freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation. I mean, this is a concept in international law that goes back to the 17th century, to Hugo von Grotius, the idea that the seas are a common resource of the world, and you can have some territorial waters to protect yourself, but beyond that, the seas are open to all. Now that's a basic premise, but if the U.S. does not support that, then nobody does. And it seems to me what the Houthis are establishing, I mean, they're doing damage to the world economy, a lot of things. They're even a non-state actor. What they're saying is there are no international laws we can break, and we can violate them pretty much with impunity. But more importantly, once again, the Houthis are only able to do this because they are being resupplied continually with weaponry, training, money from the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the U.S. does not go after the Islamic Republic of Iran for doing that. I'm going to stop there, but just read you this. White House now. This is from I forget. This is from a piece in the I forget which paper. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said Wednesday that we're doing everything we can to degrade their, meaning the Houthis' capabilities, but they're still getting supplied. They're still getting resourced by Iran. Well, yes, maybe when the Americans find out about this, there will be some consequences for it. Maybe John Kirby knows somebody in the White House.
I'll go ahead and start
Go
on
ahead.
this one. I'm sure Seth has
They're
some.
clearly not doing everything they can, because ships from Iran that carry weapons that the Houthis use are able to arrive without interdiction.
Sink one or two.
For starters.
Yeah, I would say I want to add to your support for international organizations and the international principles, Cliff, by saying that the other reason we do this is to maintain U.S. access. I would like to say the external voices, freedom of the seas for all, freedom of navigation, freedom. The inward voices make damn sure our ships, our merchants, where 90% of world trade, or 95%, depending what it is, can get through, that the international system for which we are the largest singular beneficiary economically, and we make money, we're no longer a steel manufacturer. We're someone who profits from the financing, the insurance, the shipping, the execution, the management of international trade and information exchange. So, look, there's a good internal reason for us to support this. Now, I agree completely with what Seth just said. We are not holding them accountable. There are two ways that weapons can get there. One is just direct Iranian shipments. Second is Iranian shipments that go into Oman and then do a land bridge across Oman into the Houthis. And we need to strike both of those. We are not doing everything you can do. And we are doing the least cost-effective, most risky version of dealing with this threat. We are using anywhere from $600,000 to $3 million weapons to engage, $10 to $40,000 drones and $50 to $100,000 cruise missiles. That is not a good cost exchange. We're then using $50 to $75,000 weapons multiple at a time to strike target sites, and then once in a while we use expensive $1 million missiles to do it. This is the least cost-effective way of dealing with this problem. The most cost-effective is sink a ship, destroy a supply chain moving through Oman. We give the Omanis 48 hours warning. Stop it or we'll attack it. We will violate your sovereignty, as Iran is doing, by shipping through you, and we'll hold you. And this is a partner of ours, not an ally, but we'll say we are going to hold that accountable in a way that doesn't cause Omani casualties, unless the Omanis are part of the illegal trafficking, in which case they brought that risk on themselves. And we do it. We give them 48 hours warning, and either it stops or it doesn't.
What if you went to the harbor in Iran from which the ship emerged and say, we know that from this harbor, ships are going, supplying Houthis with weapons that are stopping shipping, that have closed down essentially the Suez Canal. Suez Canal was a pretty good innovation once upon a time. And so we're not going to allow this. And so this harbor from which they're coming is going to be destroyed.
I think that's one way to do it. The other way is board the ships, seize the weapons, and then hopefully the Iranian Navy accompanies the ships next time. Sink the Iranian Navy ships, board the ships. And that's how you hope we are not going to, this is a ridiculous, we have spent more than $1 billion on defensive weapons and another $300, $400, $500 million on offensive weapons in this exchange since October about 20th.
And this incompetence, this malpractice, Seth, is the result of what you were talking about before, the Biden administration policy that we don't want to provoke the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Cliff, this is across the board.
Across the board. We don't want to provoke our enemies.
What Mark just described is as applicable to Ukraine, our policy toward Ukraine, as it is toward Israel, as it is in the Taiwan Strait, which is that the object is sort of to cool things down by turning the heat up. It doesn't work that way. So this notion of preventing escalation by somehow satisfying the enemy, it doesn't work in Ukraine. It doesn't work in Israel. It doesn't work with the Houthis. It won't work in Taiwan.
And by the way, I think we have mentioned that the waterway we're talking about from the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab, I believe, is the actual strait that they're shutting down off the Yemen's coast there, is one of the most significant strategic international waterways in the world. The other two that come to mind would be the Strait of Hormuz, which is off the coast of Iran, and the South China Sea in general. If the Houthis, a non-state actor, can effectively shut down this waterway, what's to stop Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, from shutting down the Strait of Hormuz if they want to, or Beijing from saying, as they kind of have been, these are our territorial waterways that we have various assets, reefs built into islands, then militarized. We're going to decide who goes through and who doesn't. I mean, once you establish the precedent that might decides who controls which waterways, the world is a very different place in terms of international trade, capitalism, and all that. No.
No, I agree, which is one of the reasons we're doing this, cost ineffective, defense of things. A good deal of shipping still going through. When you look at the shipping, there's a automated shipping system, which, by the way, the Houthis are using to sometimes target ships. You can still see, particularly on the container ships, where there's it's a less cost-effective shipping system. The ones whose return on investment would go way down with extra 9 to 10 days of transit to go around Africa. You're still seeing them go through. But the reason we are confronting this is for exactly what you said. If we don't do it here, there'll be other places, other straight points that come into play. Now, one thing I will say is, if the Iranians did it off the Straits of Hormuz or the Chinese did it in the Malacca Straits, in both cases, there's no plausible deniability of, well, it's the Houthis, not us. I mean, that would have to be the Iranian Navy and the Chinese Navy, and I think those are warlike actions.
But it's implausible deniability when it comes to the Houthis. It's not plausible.
They still, I get it, but we're not. It's apparently plausible enough for the Biden administration to not strike Iran.
Yeah, but I mean,
they're firing at U.S. ships.
Yeah.
So if the Biden administration's mathematics is that this is Iran, then we should be striking Iran at this point. After 7 months, like it wasn't an accidental firing at the USS Gravely or the USS Carney. They are firing at U.S. ships alongside merchant ships. And in any other context, if that's a nation state doing it to you, you need to go strike them.
John Kirby said they're getting resourced by Iran, so this is not a mystery to the White House.
Yeah, but I would say in the Vietnam War, we knew they were being resourced by the Soviet Union and China, and we did not intentionally do strikes into the Soviet Union and China.
There's a difference, I think, between what is justified and what is strategically useful.
Yeah.
In that case, it probably would have been justified but not strategically useful to strike Russia or China. In this case, I think it's both justified and strategically useful to strike against Iran as they try to resupply the Houthis.
And I think grabbing the ships would be the right thing. Yeah. And if they fight you on it, then you sink them.
Okay. That makes sense.
There are other ways of discouraging the Houthis, don't you think? I mean, they have storehouses, they have command centers, they have infrastructure, they have places where their high command live.
Are we not hitting those?
We're hitting warehouses. I think we're hitting some command and control. I don't think we're hitting the leaders in downtown. When you say leaders, like higher up the food chain leaders. Yeah. I do think we're trying to, but it's killing. We are not achieving. But despite what Kirby says, if he believes we're achieving a strategic objective.
Exactly. If what we're doing so far hasn't worked, then you have to figure out other means that are more persuasive. And we're not doing that.
All right. Taiwan. Seth, is our Navy prepared to deter Beijing from conquering Taiwan, or if not, assisting Taiwan in its self-defense, as the Biden administration, or rather as President Biden himself, has several times said he wants to do and would do, even as he cuts military spending, cuts the number of ships in the Navy, if I'm not mistaken. Are we nonetheless prepared for this eventuality?
Depends upon what the Chinese decide to use. If they go for a blockade, we're in a better position to break the blockade than if they go for, let's say, an all-out amphibious assault accompanied by a missile barrage, not only at Taiwan but at the others that they have a problem with in the area, like Japan and the Philippines. So the answer to the question of are we prepared is for what?
Okay,
For what eventuality?
Mark, take on both of because there were two possibilities here that Seth mentions. One is an amphibious assault. Wow, that's a big deal. The other is a blockade. Now, the historian Neil Ferguson suggests that in the case of a blockade, running a blockade is not so easy, and especially if it's, he doesn't say this, but if it's an administration like the current one, and China says you want to run the blockade, there are going to be Chinese deaths, American deaths, and you risk World War III. And by the way, we have nuclear weapons. You want to do that, President Biden? You really?
So first, despite being retired, I still care. You know, my son's headed over to a ship on the pointy end of this in Japan, so I'm fully vested in making sure that the answer to your question is we are ready. And look, we're not there yet, but there are three aspects to this. The first is we have to get our own forces in order. The second is we have to get the Taiwan's forces in order, and the third is we have to work together. We've been doing a lot of work. I would say uniquely, FDD has been pushing this with legislation that's been passed over the last few years. But our munitions are getting much better for Pacific fight, but only because of Ukraine. I mean, ironically, in the Bridge Colby's head-spinning world, if it weren't for Ukraine, we would not be ready.
Bridge Colby worked in the Defense Department, probably will again. He's saying we should concentrate on China and everything else. That's simplified.
At the expense of Ukraine.
At the expense of Ukraine, expense of the Middle East.
But the reality is that Ukraine exposed our munitions. Like many of us have been arguing for more than a decade. Have been arguing for certain weapon systems. Defense
industrial complex is in terrible shape.
And our munitions were at about 25% of need. They're now creeping towards 50. 75% is actually doing the war. 100% is gravy. You know, but we're creeping up the train on that. We've finally got foreign military financing grant programs like we have for Israel, for Taiwan. Smaller than the numbers, but you know, it's still there. And presidential drawdown authority like we have for Ukraine, for Taiwan. So, and Taiwan's increased its defense spending from 1.5% to 2.6% of GDP, and it's going up. But then most importantly, and this is a law that we worked hard on, we've ordered the Defense Department, we're no longer asking, they've been ordered to do exercises with the Taiwans, to do planning with the Taiwans, so we're in a better position to confront whether it's a cross-strait invasion, a quarantine or blockade, or an economic attack or cyber attack. You and I are going to Taiwan later this month to actually go through the steps of an economic coercion campaign. Can China get Taiwan for cheap? You know, we're just not going to. So we have to work on all of these. The answer is, I think we're not ready in any of the areas, but I also think the Chinese aren't ready in any of the areas. So it's a question of persistent engagement and risk. And if there's one thing I would never apply to the Biden administration, it's the concept of persistently thinking about a problem and investing in solving it. And, you know, we absolutely have to, at least in foreign policy, we absolutely have to just keep this pressure up no matter who's president a year from now, that we're working our munitions, our capability, that we're working Taiwan's munitions, Taiwan's capability, and they're working our ability to interoperate and fight together. One thing I'll add in, a big bonus, Japan has transitioned on this. The late Prime Minister Abe's greatest gift to the alliance was that he changed the way the Japanese thought. It didn't happen while he was alive, but in the last 2 to 3 years, Japan now sees an attack on Taiwan as an existential threat to Japan. You cannot underestimate the value of Japan as a solid participant in a conflict with over Taiwan to the U.S., to the Western cause. I know we got Australia there, but they're a mini-me when it comes to Japan. I mean, Japan's the real deal.
Militarily, Japan is much mightier than the Australians?
Oh, yeah, much so. They're both great. They both operate a ton of U.S. equipment and are interoperable with us. Australians probably have a better rules of engagement for participating. But what Japan has 3 or 4 times the number of systems, and they're geographically proximate to the problem. So from my point of view, those things can put us in a good position, but it's going to take real persistent engagement on all those levels of effort.
And very briefly, and the Philippines? Militarily?
I think so. The Philippines is interesting. It's more of an act like Japan and Australia. It's I expect access to your bases and I expect you to participate. Australia right away, Japan after they get the first strike against them. Philippines is different. It's about access. We'd really like access so that we can have U.S. Army and Marine Corps assets that have anti-ship cruise missiles and other capabilities, ground strike across, very close to the southern axis of a cross-strait invasion of Taiwan. I think we're closer now than we have been, obviously, throughout the whole Duterte regime. I think Marcos sees China for who they are. He's trying to thread a needle to get it to the point where we're there. But we have expanded the number of U.S. facilities that have been developed from 5 to 9. So there's 9 different facilities where we're making military construction investments in the Philippines for U.S. and Philippine forces to use, including some very proximate to the Taiwan battle area.
And let me just
Well,
go ahead.
other point another other point that I'd like to make on this is that it remains to me somewhat of a mystery what our maritime strategy would be if we found ourselves in a conflict with China.
I think it remains a mystery to the U.S. Navy what their plan is.
Right?
Yeah. I think it also remains a mystery to the U.S. Navy what their strategy would be right now.
Yeah, well,
unfortunately.
that's a major point, and until that's resolved, I think that the answer to Cliff's question about are we prepared is ambivalent, at best ambivalent, and in the absence of that strategic articulation, we're having all kinds of arguments about distributed maritime operations and retiring cruisers that we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in and buying all kinds of future systems that, if they work, they're not going to come online for 5 or 10 years, notwithstanding Admiral Davidson and Admiral Aquilino's warnings about near-term conflict between China and Taiwan. And all that stuff is up in the air. And there's no sign that it's being addressed or resolved, but it's absolutely critical to questions like fleet architecture and justification for building what I think most of us agree is necessary, which is a larger Navy.
I certainly agree. I think our military center certainly agrees. Throw this into the mix quickly. I mean, we have Vietnam is very fearful of Beijing, I think. But Cambodia, we've had 2 Chinese Navy corvettes docked at a naval base in Cambodia, which seems to be Beijing trying to set up a permanent foothold in another waterway. Here's what Craig Singleton, who's a senior fellow here and runs our China program, says. This new base serves as a platform for potential military action during a Taiwan contingency. China's goal, he says, is to impede U.S. forces from safely transiting through the Malacca Strait to China's periphery, in effect, keeping them out of sight. So is that the situation we have where we can work with Vietnam, but Cambodia has become a real problem for us?
Oh, I'd say both Cambodia and Laos are, vassal states of China at this point.
They are at this point.
Now, look, that was started as an economic relationship.
Right.
And in fact, the Laotian, they just made an agreement with China, which I think says that we're going to strip all the forest from your country. I mean, it's just a brutal relationship between Laos and China and Cambodia and China. The development at Siem Reap, ironically, a base that I was involved in doing military construction at to build for the U.S., the Chinese, they didn't like our construction. They've wiped it clean and built their own base there. But, look, this is one more access point for them. I'm not sure. Look, in a war today, this would not be determinative, their base there. But it is indicative of the fact that they have created, both Cambodia and Laos are these vassal states. They also serve to weaken ASEAN responses to anything, or ASEAN efforts to the Southeast Asian Association of Southeast Asian Nations' ability to do anything. I think that Craig's right that they have some military role, but the reality is they just reflect that Cambodia and Laos are within China's economic and security orbit.
This notion of vassal states, we want to talk more about it now, but I want to talk more about it later because you've got Belarus as a vassal state. I think Lebanon's a vassal state of Iran. I don't know if anyone's looked at vassal states in the world. I think that might be an interesting little paper to do, maybe a column to write. Anyway, let's do a quick kind of lightning round. There's a bunch of questions, but we'll do them real quick. One, NATO's 75th anniversary summit starts, Tuesday? No, next week. Next week. You're speaking at it. What just quick thoughts on what to expect? Is this a unified NATO? Is it not? Whatever you want to say about it. Just give us a couple of comments. Curtain raise.
So first, this is a great, 75th anniversary. We're celebrating that Sweden and Finland have joined over the last 18 months. That's a big deal. I think they've done the minimum required to prevent Russia from defeating Ukraine, but they're going to give Ukraine a very low calorie drink here, an idea that they have some guarantees within NATO, but they're not on a path to NATO membership, and they're also not going to agree to a 2.5% GDP, which I think would have been extremely timely given the increasing
2.5% GDP for military
for defense spending. Yeah. And I mean, given President Trump's, more likely than not being elected, that would have been a great signal from NATO to him that we heard you 5 years ago. We got ourselves 23 out of 30 above 2%. We're working the other 7 or the other 9 now, and then we're heading to 2.5%. And there's a handful of countries like the United States above 3% already, 3 or 4 of us.
We should be more than that, but yes. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that on those 2 issues, which were big issues, this is going to be a less than, a less successful meeting. But in the principle of we're standing together, we've never spent more together, since the 1989. I think this is an important meeting. It also reflects a great, outgoing event for the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, who's done just a fantastic job, I think, leading the alliance over the last almost 10 years.
And he's got a successor coming up. Any thoughts on that?
From a country that barely got to its 2%, right? The Dutch. But on the other hand, a country that is really involved. Dutch F-16s fly with us in combat. Dutch soldiers have been with us in numerous conflicts. Dutch Patriot systems are pushed forward right now. The Dutch don't spend enough, but they play hard. What you really want is an ally who spends a lot and plays hard. That would describe the Baltics, Poland, but they also fear Russia a lot more than everybody else. But I think Rutte, the outgoing, the former prime minister, is going to be it'll be tough to fill Stoltenberg's shoes, but I think he was the best selection possible.
Okay. Any thoughts on this, Seth, that you want to add?
Yeah, I think that the debate about, or the discussion about spending levels of NATO countries does a disservice to looking at the more important question, which is what is that money spent on?
True.
And are the weapons, the communications equipment, the ISR capability, the whole raft of military means that an alliance needs at its disposal, are those requirements being met, even if the spending level is? And I don't see the answer to that.
Right.
The answer to that is people gloss over that, and generally speaking, and just look at, did you meet your 2.5%? And I think that's a mistake.
I agree with that completely. I think Greece is a great example. We like Greece. They spend over 3%, but I think a good percentage of that is spent thinking about Turkey, an actual NATO ally. And I think a good percentage is spent on, they're one of those countries that even with a small military try to have an army, and navy, and air force. Why? Because Turkey has an army, navy, and air force. We don't need 32 navies. We don't need 32 air forces. I don't think you can avoid 32 armies. It's just a fact of military life. But we need to, I agree with Seth, that it needs to be, this NATO has tried hard to have capability requirements that people sign up for. But there's kind of an unsaid thing inside there. Will you maintain these forces at the right level of readiness? Will you engage in the conflicts we need to engage in? And there's a little bit less of that. You don't just get that from 2.2%. Right. It's a deeper question than that, like Seth said.
All right. Israeli Patriot systems to Ukraine, is that going to be a game changer?
So I don't think it'll be a game changer. I think, first of all, it's a weird time to announce it. Just at about the time that I thought, hey, they better dust those Patriots off and have them ready for precision-guided munitions attacks coming from Hezbollah. Even these are older Patriots. They moved to a system called David Sling, which is probably better than the older Patriots. It's their best way of getting at cruise missiles. Iron Dome is not a natural cruise missile thing. It's for mortars and rockets for the most part. So things that are maneuvering, you really want David Sling. Patriot could help with that. I think, though, if they transfer some systems, and I think eventually they will, and certainly some of the effectors, the missiles, the Patriot missiles themselves, even if it isn't all the launcher systems, to Ukraine, that is a significant movement by Israel, who has tried their hardest not for domestic Russian issues, which is the number of Jews remaining in Russia who would be subject to retaliation by Putin or Putin-inspired, right-wing, extremists. They've tried to thread a needle there, the Israeli government, but I think we're at the point now where if you're the U.S. ally, you're the U.S. ally. And Russia is now helping Iran. Iran's helping Russia. Russia's helping Iran. China's helping Russia. Russia's helping China.
There's an axis of evil, whatever you want to call it, there for sure. But there's another reason, of course, was that Russia is in Syria. Syria is on the northern border, and deconflicting has been important if you're going to go after the Iranian instructed Shia militias in Syria. So you don't want to anger Putin more than you need to. But it's kind of.
I think we're slowing to get past that.
Yeah, I think that's true.
The Israeli official attitude toward Russia has been influenced by the Syrian operations to the point where I think they tended to lose the perspective of what exactly Russia is about and lose the perspective of the Russia-Iran relationship. And the same thing with China, as far as Israel. I was in Israel, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, and commander in the Israeli Navy and I were walking in Haifa, and he pointed out to a large piece of land in the harbor and said that the Chinese are developing that land as a port for container ships. And it's about maybe 4 miles, 5 miles from the headquarters of the Israeli Navy.
Yeah, no, and they were warned on that, and I think they may have sorted that one out. But it's worse than that. I mean, the Israelis. I write about this in my most recent column for the Washington Times out this week. That they've been trying to have amicable relations with the Chinese, and by the way, using Chinese companies, they're also the cheapest to do things like drill tunnels for highways. And now it has been, I think, credibly reported that Chinese equipment and possibly Chinese engineers have been responsible for the elaborate, expensive underground tunnel network fortress of the Houthis. And TikTok is the Chinese are not going to be friendly with Russia. We know that. With Israel now.
Well, and they were told that during the Trump administration.
Yes, they were. FDD has been telling that for years.
And they ignored it.
Yep.
I think they've gotten off the China train.
Yeah, I think they understand that
I think the Russia one was a little bit harder for the domestic reasons I mentioned. But I think they're going to be off of both of them. There's an axis of authoritarianism out there. It may be a transactional axis, but the latest reporting of 4 North Korean combat engineering brigades moving to Russian-occupied Ukraine is bad shit. I mean, on top of 2.7 million rounds of artillery, on top of hundreds of ballistic missiles that are landing in Kiev, in Odessa, in Lviv, North Korean ones. North Korea and Russia, Iran and Russia, China and Russia. There's latest reporting on Chinese potentially providing, kinetic attack drones to the Russians, on top of basically backstopping their economy with oil and natural gas purchases after Europe came off in 2022.
I wouldn't worry too much about the North Koreans in Russia. They'll defect because Russia is a much freer country.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Anything else, Seth, that you wanted to make sure to get in today? Why that I should have asked and didn't?
No, I think you asked all the right questions.
All right. Anything else you want to get into?
I want to mention one other thing. Seth did a great article on hypersonics a couple of weeks ago.
Very important subject.
We believe in that here. This administration, as all of us, starting back to the Obama administration, we're slow on this because of misunderstandings about the INF treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Is that why Obama didn't invest in hypersonics?
I think that's a lot of it. Was a fear that
he didn't invest in missile defense either.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Now the problem is we're spending $4 to $6 billion a year on hypersonic offense. We're spending $200 million on defense. We've been pushing this hard here. Brad Bowman and I writing on it. We've pushed legislation through FDDA to try to get this fixed.
Yeah.
We're struggling. This administration believes that, I think at its core believes most missile defense is strategically destabilizing. I'm going to tell you right now, if the adversary has lots of offensive hypersonic weapons and we have no defense, we are baiting them into a prompt strike.
Yeah.
To hit our offensive systems as fast as they can, hit our ballistic missile defense systems so that then all their ballistic missiles can get through after their hypersonics get through. We literally are avoiding their opportunities to have hypersonic working by the congressionally mandated the law we helped pass. It said you must have an initial operating capability in 2029 for what's called glide phase intercept. They're literally doing nothing, and Congress is failing in its oversight to even have its own law be followed. And it's extremely frustrating, and it puts our sailors, airmen, and soldiers at risk in the Pacific and in Ramstein, in Europe as well.
It's the argument over the ABM all over again. Same damn thing.
Yes, it is, and worse, because the Soviets, mutually assured destruction with the Soviets, you can make an argument for, but not with the current Axis. I don't think you can.
And not with conventional weapons.
And not with conventional, right. Seth Cropsey, thanks for coming in today. Thanks for talking to us. Look forward to reading you. Look forward to talking to you again real soon.
Been a pleasure.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Good to have you all with us here today on Foreign Policy.